Texas, after World War II, is going to experience a lot of changes and growth. One of these changes is in the realm of social change, specifically civil rights and equal rights. Texas, along with other southern states, had worked since the end of the Civil War to deny African Americans their rights as citizens. Jim Crow laws were passed that imposed segregation. The state of Texas also worked to deny African Americans the right to vote. Schools were segregated, and lynching was still a problem in Texas. It still occurred and was not prosecuted by white authorities. After World War II, though, the civil rights movement, not just in Texas but in the United States, is going to grow and really start pushing for equal rights for African Americans. One of the main reasons is this: during World War II, African Americans saw that they were treated better in other countries while they were fighting in Europe than they were in their own country. Also, the hypocrisy of the United States saying that we were fighting Hitler's racism in Europe but still had racism in our own country became very obvious to many of these, not just the African American soldiers, but a lot of people around the country. Also, as we said, as many African Americans moved to large cities during the war, they created voting blocks that now had power to bring about change that politicians had to pay attention to if they wanted to be equal, or if the politicians wanted to win election. Early changes to discrimination are going to come through the Supreme Court. And Texas is going to have several specific Supreme Court cases that we're going to be involved in that will lead to national change. The first one is Smith versus Allwright in 1944. Lonnie Smith, an African American, will file a lawsuit against Texas claiming that the all-white primary in Texas was illegal. With the help of the NAACP, the case will go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will declare the all-white primary in Texas unconstitutional. The other important case is Sweat versus Painter in 1950. Heman Sweat was an African American who applied to the University of Texas Law School. When he showed up to enroll, he had not checked the box telling what his ethnicity was. When they saw that he was African American, he was denied admittance to the law school, even though they had already accepted him. Sweat, along with the NAACP and Lula Bell White, will sue the University of Texas, saying that no law school existed for African Americans in Texas. Therefore, the state was in violation of the separate but equal clause in the going back to the Plessy versus Ferguson case, and therefore he needed to be admitted to the UT Law School. Texas will try to fight this decision by creating a new African American university with a law school. It's known as Texas Southern University in Houston. It's still there, as is its law school. But the Supreme Court will rule that just having a separate school does not make them equal, and tells UT that they must integrate. And so this is a huge victory for UT, or for African Americans, that UT, the University of Texas, now has to integrate. At the public school level, the big Supreme Court case comes in 1954 with Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, where several families sued, saying that their children should be allowed to go to the white schools. It goes to the Supreme Court, and this is a landmark Supreme Court case where the NAACP, arguing on behalf of the Brown family and others, the Supreme Court will say that African American schools were not equal because of old equipment, old books, less funding, and the Supreme Court will rule that separate but equal was unconstitutional, and therefore segregation in schools is illegal and unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court will say in their Brown decision that schools need to desegregate with all deliberate speed. This is going to become a big issue because the court meant that all deliberate speed meant integrate quickly, get it done now. Southern states like Texas are going to take all deliberate speed, meaning that they could drag their feet and not integrate schools. And so 1954 is when school desegregation is ordered by the Supreme Court. Most school districts in Texas will take over a decade before they do that. In Abilene, it will take roughly 14 years before segregation is officially gone in Abilene. One of the big cases that's going to come up on this event is in Mansfield, Texas in 1957, when African American students tried to integrate the high school. A white mob supported by the Texas Rangers, the police force, will block the entrance and keep the students from entering the school. One of the more famous things is a African American effigy, a dummy of a mannequin of a African American was hung from the school to show just how much they were not going to let African Americans come. President Eisenhower will not interfere to protect the African American students, and Mansfield will actually close its schools for a year instead of integrating. This will lead Texas to pass a law saying that schools cannot integrate unless the people in the community vote in favor of it, knowing that the white majorities will not vote in favor of it. And that's one of the things Abilene will use to keep from integrating their schools, to resist the legal declaration by the Supreme Court. Other events are going to take place starting in 1954 is where we see the civil rights movement really begin. What we call the civil rights movement in Texas is going to be very involved in that. Nationally, in 1955, you have the Montgomery bus boycott, which is going to start when Rosa Parks in Montgomery, Alabama, is arrested for refusing to give up her seat on the bus. The boycott will be led by Martin Luther King Jr., and it will last a year. And it will be effective enough that the city of Montgomery will eventually give in and integrate its buses because of lost revenue. As a result, Dr. King will create the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, which will lead the national civil rights movement. And we will have SCLC branches in Texas that will work in Texas. And they will use nonviolent protest. One of the leaders in Texas who will also become a national leader is a man by the name of James Farmer Jr. He's from Marshall, Texas, was a graduate of WWII College, a historically black college there. His father had served as a professor and president of WWII College. And James Farmer Jr. will found the Congress of Racial Equality, known as CORE. They're going to use boycotts and sit-ins to desegregate businesses in Texas. And one of the big things they will do in 1960 is hold what are known as the Freedom Rides. In 1960, Congress passed a law outlawing segregation on interstate busing. So buses that are crossing state lines, it's illegal to segregate. Well, in the South, they refused to integrate their buses. So what the Freedom Riders did was in the summer of 1960, these are white and African American, mostly college students, who got on buses in the North and rode them throughout the South to bring attention to this and to force the integration on the busing. James Farmer led this. They're going to face lots of violence. One bus will be blown up. A lot of the marchers will get beaten. This will bring a lot of attention to it. And James Farmer is going to become, through CORE, a national civil rights leader. The U.S. government will get involved in the 60s in the civil rights movement. John F. Kennedy will be elected president in 1960. He will write a Civil Rights Act and send it to Congress following the attacks in Birmingham, Alabama on marchers there. In Congress, though, the bill is going to stall. Southerners are going to try to keep it from passing. They do not want a Civil Rights Act passed. Then, November 22nd, 1963, John F. Kennedy will be assassinated while visiting Dallas, Texas. When he is assassinated, Lyndon Baines Johnson, known as LBJ, who is from Texas, was the vice president. He is now president. And Southerners are excited, thinking that Johnson is one of them and that he will be against segregation. But Johnson was for civil rights. He was for ending segregation in our society. And so Johnson is going to be able to push through two major pieces of civil rights law, two of the most important civil rights laws in American history. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is going to make segregation illegal. It says you cannot segregate in public or private entities. It also gives the Attorney General the power to prosecute those that still segregate. And the Civil Rights Act said that schools had to integrate immediately or they would be prosecuted by the Attorney General. And so it's the Civil Rights Act that finally starts Abilene to move towards integrating its schools, which they don't officially get done until 1968. The other major piece of legislation is the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that will make it illegal to keep anyone from voting. At the same time, African Americans are not the only ones fighting for equality. So are Mexican Americans in Texas and in the United States. Mexican Americans are going to organize for the rights. One of the major Mexican American civil rights organizations in the country is LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, which was founded in 1929 in Corpus Christi. And they're going to take the same role as the NAACP for African Americans, that LULAC is going to use the courts to fight for the rights of Mexican American citizens. LULAC will help bring about desegregation of schools for Mexican American students. Another one who's going to play a major role is Hector P. Garcia, MD. He was a doctor. He served in World War II. And what he found was after the war that Mexican American veterans were not receiving their benefits and not receiving the same benefits that white veterans were receiving. So Dr. Garcia will found the American GI Forum of Texas, which will become the American GI Forum, which will expand and become a major organization fighting for the rights of all Hispanic residents of Texas, regardless if they were citizens or not. Some major cases that will take place in Texas. One is Hernandez versus the state of Texas in 1954. The GI Forum lawyers will argue before the Supreme Court on behalf of Pete Hernandez. Hernandez was convicted of murder, but the GI Forum lawyers are going to argue that his trial was unconstitutional because Mexican Americans were not allowed to serve on juries in Texas. Texas had a law that said only whites could serve on juries, and the lawyers will argue that this violates the Bill of Rights. This violates the United States Constitution and the right to a jury by your peers, and the Supreme Court will agree. And Hernandez's conviction will be overturned, and the law that said Mexican Americans could not serve on juries was declared unconstitutional, and so now Mexican Americans in Texas could serve on juries. Another one, Hernandez versus Driscoll Consolidated Independent School District in 1957, is going to be argued by, the American GI Forum. And in this case, the federal court will rule that segregating Mexican Americans in separate schools was unconstitutional. And so it'll bring about more change there. We also see other activities of social activism by Tejanos in Texas. One, we see farm workers in the Rio Grande Valley will organize and go on strike in 1966 over the harsh treatment and unhealthy working conditions they received. They will organize a march that will go from the Rio Grande Valley all the way to Austin to push for change. A new group, the Mexican American Youth Organization, known as MAYO, will be founded in San Antonio in 1967 by college students. MAYO is going to focus on education. They want more Mexican American teachers in Texas, not just public schools, but also universities. They want classes taught on Mexican American history. They want students being treated with respect, not being punished for speaking Spanish in school. They will hold walkouts and sit-ins in public high schools, including Abilene, that there will be in 1969 a week-long walkout by Mexican American students from Abilene High in protest over their treatment, which will cause the Abilene School Board to rethink and to change some of the racist policies and the mistreatment of Mexican American students in the Abilene Independent School District. Another group is La Raza Unida, which will be founded in Crystal City, Texas. La Raza Unida is going to be a major political group. They're going to run Mexican American candidates for office in Texas. Ramsey Munoz in 1972 will be a La Raza Unida candidate, and he will be the first Mexican American to run for governor of Texas. And La Raza Unida will bring about change that they will win some elections at the local level, that they'll start seeing more Mexican American citizens, more Tejanos elected to office, and as they serve in government can bring about change. And then finally, we have the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, known as MALDEF. Here, they worked to increase Mexican American voter participation. They're also going to encourage Mexican Americans to become lawyers and political leaders to help bring about change through the political system. Also in the late 60s and 1970s, we see women seeking equal rights. After World War II, women did not want to leave the jobs that they had worked during the war. And so they're going to start pushing for change. Several groups nationally, we have the National Organization of Women, known as NOW, which is going to push for equal rights for women in employment and education. In Texas, we have the Texas Women's Political Caucus, which is going to encourage women to become active in politics. It's going to work to elect women to office, to get women registered to vote, to get them to vote for women's issues so the government would listen to women. We also have the Texas Equal Rights Amendment will be passed. This is a amendment in Texas that provides equal rights for women. It made many laws in Texas unconstitutional that discriminated against women. Made things illegal, like laws saying that women couldn't own property, couldn't own businesses, couldn't inherit property from their fathers if they were married. It made these laws unconstitutional, so it protected women and their rights. And then Houston will host in 1977 the National Women's Conference, which will be a major conference with women from all over the country coming to push for women's rights. Will be hosted again in Houston. By 1980, over 56% of Texas women will have entered the workforce. Women are also going to move into careers that had once been seen as men-only careers, things like doctors and lawyers, business. They still face what we call the glass ceiling, meaning that while women entered these professions, they would only be promoted so high. They would never be promoted to the top administrative positions. Also, women, as part of what we call the glass ceiling, were made less money than men for the same jobs, and again did not get promoted into management. So this sexism was still there, but we're starting to see change. In politics, more women are going to get elected to office. Hattie Mae White in 1958 will be the first African-American woman elected to the Houston School Board. Irma Rangel in 1975 will be the first Mexican-American woman and also the first Mexican-American elected to the Texas legislature. By the 1980s, 60 women in Texas will have been elected to public office. Probably the most prominent woman in Texas politics in the 1960s and 70s is Barbara Jordan. She is from Houston. She went to Texas Southern University, the one created in 1950 as a way to fight integration at the University of Texas. She will then go from Texas Southern to Boston University, where she will receive her law degree. She will be a lawyer in Texas, and then she will become active in politics. In 1966, she will be elected to the Texas Senate. She's the first woman ever elected to the Texas Senate. She will hold that office until 1972, when she is elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, making her the first African-American woman and first woman elected to the House of Representatives from Texas. In 1974, she will become a national figure when she leads the House Judiciary Committee's investigation of President Richard Nixon and his cover-up of the Watergate break-in. As she leads that, she's on national TV grilling the president, cross-examining the people involved in the cover-up, in the illegal cover-up. And it's that investigation that will lead to Richard Nixon's resignation as president before he could be impeached and removed for violation of, for participating again in obstruction of justice and violating his oath of office. So she will become a national figure to the extent that in 1976, she will give what's known as the keynote address, the main speech at the Democratic National Convention, and will serve in Congress until her death in the 90s. The Cold War is another major political event that will take place during this 1945 to 1980 period that's going to dominate global politics, but also it'll have an impact on Texas. During World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were allies because we were both fighting Germany. After the war, though, the United States and the Soviet Union will begin to compete to see whose economic and political system would control the world. And the U.S. became committed to stopping the Soviet Union and the spread of communism, and this is what will become known as the Cold War, because it's a political war with lots of maneuvering and building up of weapons, but they never actually fight. It begins, this competition between the two countries. It's economic, it's political, it's social, but again, it's never directly physical, so hence the cold part name. As a result, lots of spending is going to take place on military weapons to prevent war, especially nuclear weapons. And this fear of nuclear war is going to become a major theme of life in the post-World War II era. With this, we have what's known as the Red Scare. With the Cold War, Americans become scared of a communist invasion of the United States, that communists may try to take over the United States government. One of the people who is going to build up and promote this Red Scare is Joseph McCarthy, a senator from Wisconsin. He's going to claim that he had proof of communist spies in the United States government. He's going to create a mass hysteria in the United States where hundreds of people will falsely be accused by Joseph McCarthy as a way to build his own power. He spreads these lies. There was no evidence of spies. He had no proof of any of it, but he played off people's fears to build up his own power in the government. Many of these people who were accused, who will go before the Senate committee, one of the ones he'll go after is Hollywood, claiming they're using movies and media to brainwash people. They will be blacklisted. Those who are accused could not get jobs. Eventually, though, McCarthy will be removed by the Senate. He will be, the Senate will censor him. He will be removed from office because of his false accusations. His destroying people's lives will become evident that it's just an evil act to promote his own power. He will never find any evidence of a single communist spy. Will ruin hundreds of people's lives. But this mass fear is created, though, and it's going to permeate all of American society. As a result, the Cold War in Texas, this fear of communism, Texas is going to pass several laws. One, making all public employees, including teachers, take an oath of loyalty to the United States. Texas will also require all college students to take United States and U.S. government, United States history and U.S. government classes. These will be taught in the high schools, also in the public schools, as a way to teach kids how great America is so they won't become communist. Citizens groups are going to go through schools and libraries and remove books that they don't like, that they feel are subversive. So this fear is going to influence it. One impact on Texas especially is since the Cold War is seeing military buildup, we're going to see a lot of military and economic growth based off of the military. Many of the bases in Texas are going to be built. Texas will maintain itself as a major military center. In Abilene, Dyess Air Force Base is going to be built in 1954 and is still a major base today, but it is built as part of the fear of communism and that we need to protect ourselves against the Soviet Union. Companies like Bell Helicopter out of Fort Worth, Lockheed Martin, also out of the Fort Worth area, is going to build airplanes. These are going to grow to become major companies based off of government contracts they're receiving. We will see some changes in politics in Texas. There will be divisions in the Democratic Party. Texas had been a solid Democratic state since before the Civil War. Because the Democratic Party was the conservative party. During the 1930s, though, a new liberal group is going to emerge in the Democratic Party, led by Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his New Deal. The government is going to start focusing on social issues, helping the poor. The government, specifically the Democratic Party, is going to be involved in getting people jobs. And many Texans do not like this. They're especially going to be upset in the 1950s and 60s as President Johnson and the Democratic Party is going to become the official party of the civil rights movement. And so these Texans that had supported the Democratic Party going back to the Civil War because it was opposed to African American rights, opposed to civil rights, are going to be upset when Johnson and the Democratic Party now lead this charge for civil rights, for helping African Americans. At the same time, the Republican Party, which was the party of Lincoln, in the 20th century is going to become more, starting in the 1920s especially, is going to become more and more conservative. And it's going to adopt a lot of the ideas previously held by the Democratic Party in Texas. So we're going to see a conservative shift towards the Republican Party and in the Republican Party in Texas, so that by the 1980s, the Republican Party is the conservative party and is going to dominate Texas politics. During the 1950s, though, Texas is going to play a major role in U.S. politics. The two most powerful people in the United States Congress were from Texas. Sam Rayburn was the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and the Senate Majority Leader was Lyndon Baines Johnson. When John F. Kennedy ran for president in 1960, he asked Johnson to be his vice president as a way to balance the ticket to get Southern support. And then when Kennedy is assassinated on November 22nd in 1963 in Dallas by Lee Harvey Oswald, Lyndon Johnson becomes president. And Johnson's presidency is going to be known as the Great Society. He believed it was the federal government's job to make people's lives better. Johnson is going to be very active in civil rights. He's going to pass both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. His big thing also, his favorite thing, is what he calls his war on poverty. He's going to try to raise people out of poverty in the United States and create a lot of programs that are still around today, like Medicare, which is insurance for old people, Medicaid, which is insurance for poor people. He starts Head Start, government-supported pre-K program. Gives better funding for education. Job Corps is created to help people get training for jobs. PBS, the public broadcasting system, is created. The War on Poverty starts the school lunch program. It starts WWII, which is food for infants and pregnant women. He starts the food stamp program, among other things. The impact of the Great Society is going to be great. The number of people in the United States and in Texas is going to decrease dramatically. Millions of children will receive access to preschool and healthy food at schools. Millions of old people will receive health insurance. Conservative Republicans said, though, that it's not the government's job to help poor people. They were against the government involvement in social issues, and these conservative Republicans also opposed government spending. As a result, under Richard Nixon, the president who will be elected in 1968, and the Texas government are going to work to get funding reduced and cut many of the programs during the 1970s and 80s that had been created by the Great Society. One of the major events of the Cold War that's going to dominate from the 1950s until the 1970s is the war in Vietnam. The U.S. is going to become involved in Vietnam after World War II. During World War II, Vietnam belonged to France, and both sides were working together to fight the Japanese. After the war, Vietnam thought it should receive its independence, like many of the countries in Europe, many of the areas in Europe, but France wanted to keep Vietnam as a colony. In Vietnam, a man by the name of Ho Chi Minh is going to lead a communist revolution in North Vietnam. He's going to fight the French, and in 1954, France and Vietnam are going to sign what is known as the Geneva Accords, as a putting an end to the fighting between France and North Vietnam. And what's going to happen is Vietnam is going to become divided under the Geneva Accords into two independent countries. North Vietnam, which is a communist country led by Ho Chi Minh, and South Vietnam, which is a democracy, which is going to be supported by the United States. Then, in 1954, North Vietnam will invade South Vietnam, trying to take it over and unite all of Vietnam. The United States is going to commit itself to supporting South Vietnam. The U.S. will never declare war in Vietnam, but the government will keep sending troops. And as the war progresses, it becomes more and more unpopular in the United States. People feel that the U.S. government is lying to them about how we were doing. American citizens start to question why they were fighting in Vietnam. The government argued that it was what they called the domino theory, trying to stop the spread of communism. But by 1968, the war had become so unpopular that President Lyndon Johnson will choose not to run for re-election. Richard Nixon will win, and by 1973, will sign the Paris Peace Accords with North Vietnam, ending the war, and then the United States will leave South Vietnam. But in 1975, 2 years later, the North will invade the South again, and this time the U.S. does not help South Vietnam, and South Vietnam will fall to the Northern Army, ending South Vietnam as a country and creating just the country of Vietnam. This is going to be a big political issue throughout the 70s and the 1980s especially. Questions exist of why did the United States fight if nothing was to come of it. One thing that's going to impact Texas is the United States sees a lot of refugees fleeing Vietnam at the fall of South Vietnam, but also refugees fleeing Cambodia and Laos as communist dictatorships will take over there and will slaughter people in the millions. And these refugees in the 70s and 80s, when they flee, a lot of them will settle in Texas, specifically in Houston, along the Gulf Coast, where we start to see a large Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laotian population and influence on Texas culture, which adds to the multicultural history and heritage of our state. Well, during this time, this post World War II, there's a lot of social and economic changes also that take place. One we see is growth. Texas is going to undergo major changes after World War II. Texas's economy is going to switch from an agricultural based society to an urban industrial society. The state population will skyrocket. Texas will have 7.7 million people in 1950, but this population will grow to 14.2 million in 1980. And by 1990, 80% of Texans will live in cities. So we're a urban population, not a rural population anymore. And Houston will become the fourth largest city in America. Uh, Both Dallas and San Antonio will grow to the point that they will be in the top 10 in populations in the United States. And so Texas is going to have these major cities. One national act that's going to affect Texas is the Federal Aid Highways Act of 1956. This is passed under President Eisenhower, who had seen the German highway system during World War II, and he liked this idea as a way to help move goods, but also troops if we needed to, if there was a fighting in the Cold War. And so they will create our interstate highway system. Congress will give $25 billion to build the interstates, which are going to have multiple interstates going through Texas. And the Federal Aid Highways Act is going to bring jobs and money to the states as people have to build the interstates, but also it's going to make trade and travel easier, and is designated to help with military defense too. Since Texas is going to have lots of military bases, factories as we're growing, this is going to play a major role in the boom of our economy in the 1950s and 60s, to the extent that Texas now has 16 interstate highways running through the state. With highways and cars, people begin to move to suburbs outside of these major cities, which causes decline in the large cities and the inner cities. The move to suburbs is also going to be increased by integration, as middle-class whites are going to move to suburbs to avoid having their kids go to integrated schools, a term that is known as white flight, which we will see prominently in the larger cities in Texas. The schools are not officially segregated. That's illegal, but just that the majority of the people living in these suburban areas are white, so the schools are going to be predominantly white. Environmentally, Texas is going to suffer a drought in the 1950s. It's one of the worst droughts ever. As a result, the state government is going to build new reservoirs. These are man-made lakes to provide water for the citizens, provide water for agriculture, things like that. And local governments are going to implement water restrictions. These reservoirs will also add to, such as tourism, as people using them for recreation. So it's going to build the economy as well as just provide water. And we're going to see other new construction projects. We'll see international airports created in Dallas and Houston. And in San Antonio, we see the creation of the San Antonio Riverwalk, which is the #1 tourist attraction in Texas. Even though Texas is becoming an urban society, or has become an urban society, we're still going to see a growth of agricultural production. And reason for this growth is the agricultural production, the farmers, the ranchers in Texas are going to become more modernized. We're going to see an increase in the use of machines, harvesters and tractors and combines and things like that, that will bring one person to make more of a agro-business where they can bring more land into cultivation by themselves. We'll see improved irrigation, which allows, again, water getting to areas that maybe had to use dryland farming or couldn't before. New species of crops will be brought in that grow better in Texas. Cotton is going to move west to the Lubbock area, to the Panhandle, where it gets colder, where it makes it harder for boll weevils and other things that eat the cotton to survive. And so we're going to see this transition of cotton moving west. There's going to be changes in the livestock industry. The image of the cowboys on the large ranch, now we see the rise of what are known as feedlots. A feedlot is a large outdoor area used to feed the cattle, to fatten them up, where they're then slaughtered. Ranchers are now going to sell their cattle to feedlots when the cattle are young, and then the feedlots will feed the cattle, give them grain in large pens till the cattle are ready to be slaughtered. So we no longer have these giant big ranches. Some of the historic ranches still survive, but we see more smaller ranches connected with the growth of these feedlots in West Texas. Oil is, of course, a major industry and will remain a major industry in Texas. From 1940s to the 1970s, Texas is a major leader in world oil. They're one of the largest producers. In the 1970s, though, this will change with the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, known as OPEC, is going to be formed by countries outside of the U.S., mainly countries in the Middle East or Southwest Asia, as we say. And they're going to work together to control the oil market. In 1973, OPEC is going to put an oil embargo on the United States, refusing to sell oil to the U.S. because of the U.S.'s aid to Israel. And as a result, this oil embargo is going to lead to shortages in the United States, gasoline shortages. It's going to affect the U.S. economy, is going to be hurt severely, but it's also going to create high oil prices, which is going to be good for the Texas oil industry. So in the 70s, this embargo, we're going to see lots of money flowing through the Texas oil industry. Many Texas oil companies will expand, but when the embargo comes to an end in the 80s and oil prices are going to crash, the Texas oil industry is going to become devastated. It's going to be a massive economic impact that's going to, in the 80s, is going to negatively influence the Texas economy. Texas is going to play a role in what's known as the space race. Is this part of the Cold War? In 1957, the Soviet Union will launch the first satellite, Sputnik, into the air. Americans are questioning, why does the Soviet Union have a space program and we don't? So John F. Kennedy is going to create NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and announce that by the end of the 1960s that we would put a man on the moon. As a result, in 1963, since Lyndon Johnson is vice president, Houston will get the Manned Spacecraft Center, will be built in Houston, later named the Johnson Space Center, is going to be the headquarters for the manned space flight for NASA. It is still a major headquarters for NASA today and is a major part of the Houston economy and is going to influence lots of technological industries and growth in Texas. Texas is going to play a role in advances in electronics. Texas Instruments will be a company that will be created, which will be a major technological company. They're the build first radios to use transistors. This will send electrical signals much faster. They will start making computers, and they will invent the pocket calculator, which will be a major innovation in math that it allows people to do math quickly and accurately. Jack Kilby is another Texan. He's going to invent the integrated silicon circuit, which will be the first computer chip, which will allow computers to process faster and grow to the home computers that all of us are used to now. And then another one, a company, Electronic Data Systems, started by H. Ross Perot. It's going to process data for big companies using, again, computers and computer growth. Perot will become one of the richest people in the world and will influence Texas politics and national politics. Texas will also play a role in healthcare. Texas will become one of the leaders in the healthcare industry in the country. MD Anderson Cancer Center in Texas, specifically down in Houston, is the major leader in cancer research in the world. People from all over the world come to MD Anderson for cancer treatment. Two Texans, Michael DeBakey and Denton Cooley, are going to pioneer open heart surgery. The first heart transplant will be done in Texas, and Houston will become a major location for plastic surgery. They'll dominate the plastic surgery industry. As a result of all of this, Texas will become a very prominent role, leader in the United States, that we're one of the states that is going to influence the national economy, national culture. And with that, Texas will then move into the modern era, the 1980s and 90s, which will bring about its own new changes and events.